Chinook or king salmon are an essential subsistence resource in the Yukon River Basin and throughout much of Alaska. Salmon eggs hatch in the spring, and the juvenile Chinook spend 1 year feeding and growing in the river before they swim out to the sea as smolts. We're trying to understand how the conditions salmon experience during this juvenile stage affect how big they can grow before they enter the ocean, and ultimately how many return as adults.
Here in the Chena, we've seen that after a warm, dry year, the fish can be 60% larger than they are after a cool, rainy year. The Boreal Fires component of the Fire and Ice Project is interested in how wildfire affects Alaskan ecosystems and the people that depend on them.
Persistently, stubbornly low Chinook salmon runs over the last decade plus have had tremendous impacts on food security, subsistence culture, and jobs. It's these human impacts that motivate us and our collaborators at the Tanana Chiefs Conference to try to figure out what's going on.
We're on the Chena River today, and this is a really ideal place to do this research because people have been studying Chinook salmon here for decades. We're right below the first bridge on Chena Hot Springs Road. It's one of the biggest producing Chinook salmon tributaries in the entire Yukon River drainage. We're sampling above and below the burn scar of the Nugget Creek fire. We have these two gizmos that are measuring little tiny bugs that are floating in the river that salmon eat, and the drifting debris, so little tiny bits of wood and organic debris that looks like bugs that salmon spend a lot of time and energy chasing. So we have this diaphragm pump that is pumping water out of the river. So we know the exact volume of water that we're sampling. The water basically falls through a net, so that way the net doesn't clog nearly as easily, and we can kind of pat it down and keep the debris from clogging the net. We can only use it on road-accessible gravel bars, but we're learning some really interesting stuff, like the densities of these little tiny invertebrates are about an order of magnitude higher than we previously thought based on traditional drift net measurements. And then the bug samples, we're collecting two size fractions. So we have a traditional coarse mesh net that's like a traditional mesh size that people have used in the past. That's nested inside a fine mesh net. The bugs are basically, they're getting counted and ID'd and then measured so we can quantify how much food there is for fish. We're also interested in this fine scale debris, so like 1, 2, 3, 4 millimeter long little pieces of wood. My colleague Jason Neuswanger with South Fork Research, he invented this machine that is basically this black box. We put it in the river and water flows through. There's a camera in there taking photos, and it does that for an hour. And then Jason wrote this computer vision algorithm to basically count and measure all these little bits of debris that are flowing through. Chinook salmon are a crucial fisheries resource and for cultural value. So people go to fish camp and little kids all the way up to adults and elders all have different jobs. Processing these fish is just a crucially important subsistence resource. In the Chena, we know that changes in stream flow are strongly associated with changes in productivity of the population.
We're finding that downriver of the Nugget Creek fire scar, the water is warmer and there are more bugs for fish to eat, but there's also more sediment and tiny bits of debris in the water. Despite all these differences, we found that juvenile Chinook salmon actually grew to almost exactly the same average body size, both upriver and downriver of the fire scar. This suggests that juvenile Chinook in our study area were resilient to the impacts of this particular fire. Now we're inputting our field data into drift foraging models to better understand what this means in general for how fire affects salmon across the broader Yukon River Basin.